Tempted to have you raise your hands on this one, but I kind of feel like this one might be too personal. Oh yeah, Rob's going, oh, here we go. But have you ever felt like you needed something more, something deeper? A time when you couldn't seem to find comfort or relief. It might be that something had happened in your life. It might be a certain birthday. It might be a number of things. But there's those moments in life, those seasons in life where we might even say, I need something deeper or I need something more to calm me or a deeper comfort. I believe tonight in Psalm 139, this is one source for that kind of help. The title tonight is You Are There. You Are There. Make sure we're linking up here. Okay. From Psalm 139. It's a psalm that you have probably heard portions of in your life. If you've been a Christian or a churchgoer or a Bible reader much, you've probably heard at least some of this quoted or read. I don't know how often in my experience, we study the whole psalm. And I've never preached this psalm. I've preached portions of it in a part of other sermons, but I realized this past week that I'd never really actually preached this psalm, and that's unfortunate on my part maybe, because it is so rich. Then again, there's a lot of passages of Scripture you could say that. Maybe you could say that about all of them. This psalm offers us a deeper comfort. I read recently about a man who was facing, you could call it a midlife crisis. He had a certain birthday, and he was going through what he called a deep depression. And one of the things that helped him, not the only thing, and I'm not here tonight to say there are easy fixes or there aren't situations where we might need some actual medical help or need something more thorough than just read and study a passage of Scripture. You might need some actual counseling and things like that. I'm not here to say that isn't sometimes needed. But here's one anecdotal example of a man who was going through crisis of mental health, and he turned to a mentor, and the mentor, one of the things they did was turn him to this psalm, Psalm 139. Said, go read that several times, meditate on it, a few days, that kind of thing. And he said it was one of the things, a big part of what helped him get over that, you want to call it a hump, emotionally, mentally, to be able to find, and he called it that. He called it deeper comfort than what you find on the surface that we find in the world or in what people tell us, a deeper comfort. Something else about this psalm is that the word know, our English word know, you're going to find that about half a dozen times, depending on your English text, in the 24 verses of Psalm 139. Most of those are in reference to God, to God's knowledge, and that's a big part of the psalm. That is the central idea, really, of this psalm, is what God knows and where God is in His knowledge. You'll also find that our knowledge, what we can know about what God knows, is key in Psalm 139. So be on the lookout as you read through this, as we read through it tonight. Look for that word, K-N-O-W, know. What do you know? What does God know? Here's that bottom line up front. And I'm not telling you to get up and leave because you've got the sermon. We're going to look, there's a bit more to the psalm, a bit more to the sermon than just this. But everything revolves around that. This is more of that central idea, the foundation here. So if you can walk out tonight and at least know these two truths or be reminded of them. As Christians, a lot of what we do in Bible study and sermons and classes, if you'd ask me, yeah, but I needed a reminder. So there they are, that God knows us. And I'd like you to make it more personal in your own thinking. Maybe if you're making notes, make it a personal note that God knows me. And then, right with that God is with us. God knows us, and God is with us. If I can ground my life, my heart, in those two realities tonight, this week, and beyond, then there might be some changes in how I feel, even more how I live. And that's part of our problem sometimes, isn't it? Is that we lose our center ourselves, we lose our grounding. And these are the realities, two of them, big ones, in the Bible, and for sure in Psalm 139. Here's how I've outlined this psalm for our look tonight. First 12 verses are God's knowledge. There's that central subject, and that, big surprise, takes up a big chunk of the psalm as far as the number of lines in this song, but also it's the first big section. First dozen verses are all about what God knows, God's knowledge. And then you get an example, a specific example in the middle, 13 through 16, of just how intimate and how long God knows us or has known us. It's an example of that. And then the focus shifts. The big transition in the psalm in verse 16, 17 through 24, those last few verses are us responding. It's the writer and us through him tonight responding to God's knowledge and even the specific example given. You get some of that in the first 12 verses, and even in 13 through 16, the response is laced throughout. The focus changes to what we should respond or how we should respond, what we should be doing in responding in those last few verses. Having said all of that, let's dig in. Let's go back now to the beginning of the psalm and take a look at these first 12 verses. God's knowledge. God's knowledge. I'll go ahead and have you raise your hand on this one. Can anyone in here read other people's thoughts? Anybody? Okay, we got one in the back. I know who that is. I mean, I know him pretty well, actually. I can't read his thoughts, but yeah, he's a little weird anyway. So, and if those of you who don't know, that is my brother. Okay, in flesh and spiritually. All right. Most of us can't do that. Now, there might be some people that you know, and you know them well enough because you've lived with them or you've known them long enough. You can get pretty close by reading their facial expressions. They might be partly because they are one of those that what they think, they say with their face. Okay, it's that no poker face thing. But when we're really being a bit more serious, we can't read other people's thoughts. I mean, if you're like me, you have enough trouble reading your own thoughts, okay, and knowing what you're thinking and trying to figure out some of those thoughts in your head than other people. But we'd like to sometimes, and maybe more than sometimes. We'd wish, I wish I knew what they were thinking. And sometimes it's what were you thinking when you did that? But no, we can't do that. And that's beyond our abilities as mortal, finite human beings. But Psalm 139 reminds us tonight that is something that God can do. Let's read these first 6 verses together. God knows us. Psalm 139, beginning at verse 1. Here's what he writes. This psalm is attributed to David. You might even see that in a subscript. He says, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. Or one version says, you understand my motives. It's about intensity there and depth when he says it from afar. Verse 3, you search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. The Net Bible, or the NET, it puts it this way, that you know everything I do. Think about it that way. And in verse 4, even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all together. Do you see how he keeps combining and compiling all of these intensifying words? It's you know my thoughts from afar, even before it's either spoken on my tongue, or since it's on my tongue there, that poetic language, it might be even, it's before you even say it, but it's just right there on the tip of your tongue. So even before really you know what you're about to say. Sometimes we say things without really even thinking anyway. But the point is that God knows what I'm going to say before I say it. Maybe even he's saying, God knows what I'm going to say before I even have the thought created at all that leads to saying those words. And then you're acquainted with all, and you know my thoughts all together. It's not even that God has an idea of what I'm going to think or say before I think or say it, or he has, he can tell you the basic idea. No. God knows. Period. It is that penny for your thoughts idea. I'm reminded of an old Twilight Zone episode. We got any Twilight Zone fans in here? Got a few. Okay, I'm talking about the old show. There's one of the most popular episodes is A Penny for Your Thoughts, and it's the man who's given the ability to do just that, to hear in his head what other people are thinking around him. And at first, he's pretty excited. It's a pretty cool ability to have. Like we said, wouldn't you like to know what people are saying about you, but just keeping it on the inside? Before even that short episode ends, it becomes a curse. For humanity, it might be a curse, because it gets him in trouble, and it starts driving him crazy. What if you could hear everybody's thoughts just in your close proximity? Just in this room tonight, what if we could hear everybody's thoughts? And you might not want to. But the point here is that God does hear everybody's thoughts across the world. And even just thinking about that, how does God process all that? Even that's hard to wrap your mind around. We can't even hardly understand God's understanding. Much less do we have anywhere close to his actual knowledge. Now look at these next two verses in this same section. Then he says this in verse 5, you hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. And although that might read as it's somewhat of an aggressive thing, we say lay hands on somebody, or they laid their hands on me. It seems, given the context, because the writer here, whether it's David or whoever, so far at least, and even as you continue, he's not writing with this odd or off relationship with God. And he's not afraid of God's knowledge here. And this language is used in other places for gentle, assuring, laying your hand on. It's what Israel does with his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh. The same phrase is used. He lays his hands on their head as he blesses them and predicts some things about their future. It's that kind of gentle hand. But it's a part of God's intimate knowledge here of the writer and of us, that it's like God lays his hand on our shoulder, reassuring us, I know you. And when you go through all of these verses, I think you see some of that accommodative language. Like the beginning in verse 1, when he says, you've searched me. That means to perform a minute investigation, like a detective who comes in and gets out, maybe like Sherlock, the old magnifying glass. Now, does God actually have to do that kind of thing to know us? Shake or nod? No, I don't think so. I mean, God knows. He doesn't have to go to our address and find it on the GPS, and we don't have to send him a pin and all that. He's going to know. And so there's some accommodative language, I think, here. Does God literally have an arm that he puts on our shoulder? Well, no. That's the picture of his knowledge and his care. Verse 6 is how you get part of the response. He says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. This is too much for me. So is there anybody that knows everything about you? We might think of our spouse. We might think of parents knowing about their children, but that one doesn't work very well either. Yeah, there might be people that know us better than anybody else on this earth. But I'm not even sure that we ourselves fall into this category. There's a reason the Bible warns us so often about self-deception. Do not be deceived. Because deep down, yeah, we know. But we pretend and play with ourselves and try to deceive ourselves so much and think we're better than we are. And the only one maybe that really knows everything about us, everything we even thought about doing that we didn't do because we thought better of it, is God. But here's the really incredible thing. It's already implied here. It's not directly stated, but here it is. God knows us and still loves us. Someone remarked that once, that how is it possible that God knows everything I thought yesterday and didn't kill me in my sleep last night? Like, how does that work for a holy, just, righteous God? He knows us better than we know ourselves, and He still loves us anyway. And we were discussing this morning with marriage. That's sometimes where problems begin, is you get to know the other person better than you knew them before you were married. And you just thought you wanted to marry this person, because when you're dating, things are kind of great. When you're married, they're not always so great. And then you find out that they squeeze their toothpaste instead of rolling it up, right? Got some of you. So even though there is some shock and awe here, and even in verse 6, that's too much, it's too wonderful. Now, you are beautiful beyond, as we sing. There's still a comfort even here in that God knows me that well. And not to say that God will not punish the unrepentant. That's not the case either. But Jesus came and died. And it wasn't that God knew us. It was that God really knew us. And then, adding to that, in verses 7 through 12, the clock is moving, so we're going to move to the next section. He says God is with us. And I say adding to that because, as I see it, this is all about God's knowledge. That part of why God knows us is because God is with us everywhere. God is, the big term is He's omnipresent. And omniscience would be His knowledge. He's everywhere and He knows everything. Psalm 139 is a key passage in realizing that. Let's read 7 through 12. He says, "Where shall I go from your spirit?" And I don't think he's trying to get away. He's just realizing he couldn't if he wanted to. Some people want to, like Jonah. He says, "Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there." That's where the title comes from for this sermon. "If I make my bed in Sheol, or in the grave, or with the dead, you are there." He gets more poetic now. "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea," and that could be east and west. If you're in Palestine, the wings of the morning, the sun comes up in the east toward Persia. The west is the Mediterranean Sea. So from the east to the west, he strings together all these polar opposites here. Verse 10, "Even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me." And note, still, he doesn't just say you are there. He's already said that. That's important. But then he adds and says, you're there to lead me, to guide me with your hand as you hold me. Verse 11, "If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you." He doesn't say, even in the darkness, you're there with me. That's what he's saying, but he doesn't just say that. He says, because you're there, darkness isn't even darkness anymore. And then the rest of verse 12, "The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you." And there's 3 lines there about light and darkness. Did you see that in verse 12? As if he doesn't want us to read that one too quickly, that point, about God being light in the darkness. In the darkness of my soul, in the darkness of a midlife crisis, or losing a loved one, or losing my health, or whatever that darkness is, God is with us. And that should calm us. It might not. All of this might terrify us. It's like the old meme on social media where somebody is excusing their sinful behavior with the wave of the hand that says, "Well, God knows my heart." And then there's the guy responding, "That should scare you. If you have a reason to not want God to know you and a reason to want to get away from God, and we all do at some point in our lives, then yeah, Psalm 139 is not comfort. But if you've turned to God like the psalmist, and you're living with God and for God faithfully, not perfectly, then all of this, that God knows us and He still loves us, and God is with us wherever we go, whatever happens, come what may, then there might not be anything more calming. And I use that word calm because in my heart, when I think about moments in my life, it's easy to get chaotic up here. There's lots of messages coming in. There's lots of worries and cares and concerns, those things that Jesus says choke His word. But if I stop and ground myself in these realities, God knows me, and God is with me. No matter what I feel at the moment, no matter how bad it looks and how bleak the future appears right now, I can know these two truths. God's knowledge. There is a song that it's becoming somewhat popular. Here's a couple of lines from that as we reflect on God's knowledge. It says, "Your grace abounds in deepest waters. Your sovereign hand will be my guide." And I don't know if the author was thinking of Psalm 139, but when I read these lyrics, I think there's some similarities at least. Where feet may fail and fear surrounds me. You've never failed and you won't start now. So I will call upon your name and keep my eyes above the waves when oceans rise. My soul will rest in your embrace, for I am yours and you are mine. And that song is called Oceans, in case you're curious. God's knowledge. But now we turn back to Psalm 139 for an example of this closeness that God has with us, His knowledge of us. Psalm 139, verse 13 through 16. He says, "For." Here's an explanation. Here's all that you know and all that you're with me. Because you've been with me, paraphrase, from my beginning. For you formed my inward parts. He says, God, you made my organs. You made my heart and my mind. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. It's like God is at the weaver's shuttle. Make sure the picture's up there. All right. It's like God is at the weaver's shuttle, working and weaving from the beginning, from conception as the cells form. And then there's the different phases of that human development at that age. It says you weren't just there. You didn't just know about it. Part of the reason why you know me like nobody else is because you made me. Look at verse 14. He says, I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made, or I am fearfully set apart for your glory, would be the implication there. There's a Hebrew spelling issue there. Be aware of that. It doesn't really change anything. It's just a spelling issue with how you might translate that. The overall point remains the same as we see in the rest of verse 14. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. Have you ever prayed that prayer? A prayer of thanks to God for the way He has created your body. Yeah, it might have its issues, and we were talking about gauges this morning for marriage. Your body, you might have some gauges going off or a check engine light sometimes, and it might make some sounds, but we're still fearfully, wonderfully made. You ever thought about the healing process built into our bodies? Yeah, it slows as we age. Still amazing to think of how that can happen. And you can go to bed one night with a pretty good cut, maybe on your finger, and then the next morning it might not be gone. Again, depending on how old you are. If you're 4, it might be gone. If you're 40, it might still be there. But the change is there. It already looks more normal. Verse 15. He says, my frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. I don't know if that's just a poetic way of talking about creation in the womb, or if it's connecting what God does in the womb to what God did with Adam, the depths of the earth, when God picked up dust and breathed into his nostrils. Here's the thing. And there are people that have said, I think it's that God made Adam from dust, and then God made Eve from Adam. So he already stole from Adam to make Eve, and then procreation just happens. And we know how babies are made, although some people get questioned about that sometimes. I don't think Psalm 139 allows us to think that. It's that God is the creator of all things, all human beings, even babies in the womb. So it's God's work. And I'm not saying that they are really different, or that one is somehow less sacred or problematic than the other. Taking innocent life, it's a problem, period. But when we enter into this realm of God's sacred weaving, of a human being that clearly from this passage, and you can say it's just poetry, but there's other passages to confirm it for that matter, personhood that's here. I don't know. I don't know what you say about that. To intervene in God's sacred work. And thankfully, there's a movement that's growing to change that. And there's a mystery here because we still, with all of our biological, scientific knowledge, conception. What is that other song we sing? That though men may search, they cannot find. Who holds the germ within his hand? God does. We still don't know how life happens because God makes it. We still don't understand personalities and what makes you you. We know some things and we talk about it and we get degrees in it. But there's a mystery here that only God knows from the beginning of this psalm on. And then verse 16, he says, your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, purpose. You see, the takeaway here is not just about abortion. It's that, but then it's also about who we are and how we live as adults even. Because our purpose started when God formed us and knew us and wrote down some things in his little book about us. He says, when as yet there was none of them. An example of just how intimately God knows you. God knows me. It's not like God one day had to be introduced to you. It was more like one day you woke up and realized God had been there all along. God knows us. God is with us. How do we respond? Let's look at the last part of the psalm. The psalm and the sermon will be ours tonight. We've seen God's knowledge. We've seen an example of it. Now, our responding to it. Begins in verse 17. 17 and 18, the response is stunned. I put a question mark because I think that's the best way to summarize it. There's a mixture of emotions here. He says, how precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast. So there's value, precious, like the baby that is so precious, that his thoughts are so precious. But then he says they're also so vast, so large, so grand. How vast is the sum of them? It's almost like he's starting to do some math. Sum is a math term, right? If I would count them, keeps going, they are more than the sand. An ancient way of saying you can't count. Think about the promises made to Abraham about his descendants. More than the sands beside the sea. I awake and I am still with you. So you are there. I am still with you now. And this one's a little, there's some some poetry here, and so I saw where somebody translated this as, even if I could count all of your thoughts about me, when I wake up, because I would fall asleep counting, I would still have to contend with you. Like, even if I could think about all that you think about me, then I'd still have to figure out you, God. How do you comprehend an infinite being like God? And somebody comes along and says, well, if you could totally comprehend God, he wouldn't be God, or you wouldn't be human. So he's stunned by this. Like, where do I even begin to think about this and count this? It's like trying to count your blessings. You can't count them all. And so you walk away in awe. But then it's different. Verse 19 through 22, it is slay. And we get a psalm. And I use this word because if you do any reading about psalms or sections like this, you're going to see this word, imprecatory. And it's another of those fancy words to say it's when the writer calls on God to form his justice in sometimes pretty bold and even pretty graphic ways. This is strong stuff. Look at it. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Have you ever prayed that one? And there are some that suggest there is a conflict between this and the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, when Jesus says, turn the other cheek and pray for your enemies, not pray that they would die. I don't know that there's a conflict as much as a perspective. Jesus is discussing something different in perspective than this, where here I have reached a depth in my grasp of God's justice and what sin is. Just how horribly sin perverts and uglies God's beautiful world. So that I can purely say, God, and you might say in your prayer, if you were to pray something like this, if they don't repent, they repent, great. But if they're bent on their wickedness, they're bent to hurt people, they're bent to destroy your world and your good work, previous example, then you do what you do as a just God. Stop them, sooner or later. He then says this, O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name, he says to God, in vain. Or they don't have your name with them at all. Verse 21, do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? And then to make sure we don't miss the rhetorical questions, he says, I hate them with complete hatred. Verse 22, I count them my enemies. But we say, you love the sinner, you only hate the sin, don't we? It's popular. Part of this is the English language and the way that we think of hate and loathing as being bad kind. But what is at work here is when I take that grasp of God's justice and what sin is. Did you see how he describes sin here? It's against you. It's malicious. And I have zero support, zero affirmation of that. And if someone is bent on that kind of life, then I need to be careful. I don't know that it means you walk around and you start calling out and say, you're my enemy and you're my enemy. I don't know that it's that. But it is a recognition that is strong and embedded in my heart that if someone is against God, then when all is said and done, they're my enemy. Doesn't mean I go out and kill them. Don't get that idea. But it does mean there's a line in the sand. And it's not a suggestion for who God is and those that stand against God. Now the last two verses, 23 and 24, 2 and 1. Search and see. What's behind door number 2? The plea now for God to search me so that I am not like those in the previous verses myself. Again, we ask, does God have to do this to know me? No. I don't think God literally gets that investigative glass out. He knows anyway. Before I even pray this prayer, he knows me. It's some accommodative language, but it's also a reminder to the prayer that I am to open my heart as I pray, as I read and study, as I hear the Word of God, so that I'm like an open book to God and also to me. Because in order for real change to happen, so that I don't end up like the things he says here, I have to pray and think this way. God will know me anyway, and then when I return that by saying, I'm open. That's a scary thought. Say, God, I want you to take a good look. Read it with me. Psalm 139, 23 and 24. Search me, O God, and know my heart. There's that last use of know. Try me. Put me to the test, God. Whew. You know my thoughts. And see if there be any grievous way in me. If you like to mark and underline your Bible, you might make some kind of note about that word grievous there. Because it's also a word that means idolatry. Best I get is that it's a reminder built into the definition of the Hebrew term that if you follow the way of idolatry, the end result is grief, sorrow, and pain. Now, there's going to be some grief and sorrow when you follow Jesus, but the end result for idolatry is grief. And then the last line, and lead me in the way everlasting. Take me back to what Jeremiah calls the ancient paths, the good way, following the good Creator God. In Psalm 139 this evening, we've seen God's knowledge. God knows me. God is with me. And then an example of that, He's known me and been with me from my own beginning. And then how I should respond. To be stunned in awe of how great that God is, who God is. To get into the depths of His justice and what it means to stand against God, a God who knows everything. And then the simple prayer. God, take a look so that I don't wander from you. The invitation song is prepared. We are ready if there's anything you need tonight to help you, to assist you. Let's close with this reading. This is from the well-known writer Charles Hodge. He writes about his early days at Princeton, and here's what he says. It was my privilege to be the pupil assistant of Professor Joseph Henry, the illustrious scientist, when, for the first time, electric signals were sent from point to point, the earth itself being used for the return current. Professor Henry put me at one end of the circuit when he stood directing the experiments at the other end. I can well remember the wonderful care with which he arranged them. Very often, when the testing moment came, he would raise his hand in adoring reverence and call upon me to uncover my head and worship in silence. He would say, because God is here, I am about to ask him a question. Let's stand and sing together.